The prison in autumn smelled like rust and rot, and something older than either, a combination of damp concrete, Walker stench baked into the yard's chain link, and the particular cold that crept through broken windows and settled into bones like a slow poison. Carl Grimes had learned to stop noticing most of it. You stopped noticing the smell of the world after it ended. You stopped noticing a lot of things, or you went the way of the ones who couldn't. He was exploring Cell Block D's far corridor, something Rick had told him not to do 3 times, which meant Carl had done it twice already and was working on a third, when he found the wall. It wasn't remarkable at first, just another crumbling section of prison masonry where moisture had been working at the mortar for decades. Long before the turn, long before any of this, a section of the lower wall had given way near the floor, exposing a hollow roughly the size of a storage crate, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth so old it had fused partially to whatever it protected, sat something that did not belong in any prison. Carl crouched. He unwrapped it with the careful hands of a boy who had learned that the world punished carelessness absolutely. The skull was enormous, larger than any human skull he'd seen, and he had seen too many. Carved from what looked like black river stone, its surface covered in patterns that wound around the cheekbones and eye sockets like ivy frozen mid-climb. Geometric symbols ran along the jaw in rows so precise they looked machined, rather than hand-cut. The crown of the skull bore a single deep carving of a horse mid-gallop, where its mane rendered in such fine detail that Carl almost expected to feel it move under his fingertip. Around the eye sockets, someone had inlaid chips of dark red stone, garnet, or something older than garnet, that caught the corridor's faint light and threw it back like dying embers. It was beautiful in the way that things built around death were sometimes beautiful. Carl recognized that quality now. He'd seen it in Michonne's katana. He'd seen it in the careful, deliberate way Darryl cleaned his crossbow bolts. Beautiful things in this world were almost always weapons, or warnings, or both. He should have left it. He picked it up. The stone was cold. Not the ordinary cold of a thing sitting in shadow, but a cold that had intention behind it. A cold that pressed against his palms with purpose. Carl held it for 30 seconds, feeling the weight of it, tracing one of the geometric symbols along the jaw with his thumb without meaning to. Then he heard Judith crying from the block's main chamber. Her hunger cry, the one that started low and built. And without fully thinking about it, he carried the skull with him when he went to her. He set it on the concrete floor beside her makeshift crib while he lifted her and tried to do what Maggie had shown him. The rocking, the rhythm, the patience that didn't come naturally to a boy who'd grown up in the end of the world. Judith's crying softened almost immediately. Carl assumed it was the rocking. He didn't notice in the corridor's dim light the way her small, unfocused eyes had found the skull's garnet inlays and fixed on them with an infant's absolute wordless attention. He didn't notice the way her tiny hands stretched toward it, fingers spreading. He didn't notice when her fingertips made contact with the stone, just barely, just the tips, and the garnet chips flickered once, like coals breathed upon. But something else noticed. Somewhere far out beyond the prison's fences, beyond the tree line where the walkers shuffled in their endless, aimless migration, beyond the road that had once led to Woodbury, in a darkness that sat between the living world and whatever waited past its edge, something that had been still for a very long time shifted. Not waking. Not yet. Something more like the first movement of a sleeper who has finally heard, after years of silence, a sound they recognize. The prison's lights, what few still worked on the generator's diminishing fuel, flickered once and steadied. Carl didn't notice that either. He was focused on his sister, on keeping her quiet, on being the protector Rick needed him to be in a world that had taken their mother and kept demanding more. He was 12 years old and carrying weight that would have broken most adults, and he did it the way he did everything now, with his jaw set and his eyes forward, and the particular determined blankness of a child who had decided that feeling things too much was a luxury the apocalypse didn't offer. He carried Judith back to the main chamber. He forgot the skull on the floor. He did not go back for it that night. But that night, for the first time in months, Carl dreamed. Not the usual dreams of blood and his mother's face and the sound a gun makes in an enclosed space, but of a field he didn't recognize. Nick gray-green under a sky bruised with stormlight and fog moving across it in slow, deliberate waves. And through the fog, at a distance that made it impossible to be certain of what he was seeing, something moved. Something large. Something that had the shape of a horse and rider, but wrong at the top. The silhouette ending at the shoulders in a ragged line where a head should have been. It did not move toward him. It stood at the field's edge, absolutely still, and it faced him, and even without eyes, even without a face, Carl understood with the dream's absolute unreasonable certainty that it was watching, that it had been waiting, that it was deciding something about him and about the small, warm weight of his sister that would not be undecided. He woke to the prison's gray morning with the cold still in his palms and Judith sleeping peacefully beside him. And somewhere in cell block D's far corridor, the carved skull sat in the dark, and its garnet eyes held their faint, deep light, like something patient that has finally been given a reason to stir. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. All men must die, but legends endure. Rick Grimes found the skull before Carl could decide what to do about it. That was the thing about the prison. It was large enough to feel like freedom compared to the highway camps and the farms, but small enough that nothing stayed private for long. Rick had been doing his rounds of the cell blocks. The methodical security check he performed twice daily with the focused intensity of a man who needed tasks the way other men needed sleep. When he'd pushed open the cell block D corridor door and found the oilcloth on the floor and the carved stone skull sitting beside it like it had always belonged there. He'd stood looking at it for a long moment. Then he'd called for Herschel. By the time Carl came back to retrieve it, he'd been turning over excuses in his mind all morning, ways to explain why he'd been in the restricted corridor, ways to make the skull sound less significant than it felt. His father and Herschel Green were already crouched over it in the main chamber, the old veterinarian turning it carefully in his weathered hands, while Rick stood with his arms crossed and his eyes doing the calculation they always did now. Knew assigning threat levels to things before assigning names. "It's your?" Rick asked when Carl appeared in the doorway. There was no accusation in it. That was the thing about Rick after Lori. The anger had gone somewhere internal, somewhere it didn't show on the surface anymore. What showed instead was a kind of exhausted precision. Everything measured, everything weighed. "I found it," Carl said. "In the wall, back corridor, D block." Rick looked at him. Carl met it. "I told you not to go back there." "I know." Rick let out a breath through his nose. Not quite a sigh, not quite anger, and turned back to Herschel. The old man was tracing the geometric patterns along the skull's jaw with one careful finger, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. His expression the one he wore when something interested him despite his better judgment. "Pre-Columbian, possibly," Herschel said, though his tone carried its own uncertainty. "The carving style has elements I've seen in textbooks. Certain Germanic runework, possibly. Some of these symbols here," he indicated the rows along the jawline, "have parallels in Northern European traditions. Hessian, maybe. Pennsylvania Dutch. This region has deep German immigrant roots, going back 300 years. He paused, tilting the skull so the garnet inlays caught the light. "But the stonework itself is unlike anything I can place precisely. Whoever carved this knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't decorative. This was," he searched for the word, "purposeful." "Purposeful like what?" Rick asked. Herschel set the skull down on the table between them and looked at it the way a man of faith looks at something that troubles his faith, not by contradicting it, but by confirming the parts of it he'd always found uncomfortable. "Like a vessel," he said quietly. "Like something built to hold." The words sat in the room with them. Rick picked up the skull, turned it over, checked the interior the way he'd check a found weapon, looking for modification, for danger, for the practical threat first. Finding nothing, he set it back down and looked at Carl. "Where exactly in the wall?" Carl told him. Rick listened without interrupting, the way he listened now, completely, storing everything. "And you just picked it up?" "Yes, and brought it to Judith." Carl felt something shift in the air of the room when Rick said it that way. Not accusation. Solely awareness. His father had seen things in the last 2 years that had permanently altered what he was willing to consider possible, and Carl watched him consider it now. The specific detail of the skull being brought to an infant, the infant's proximity to it, the question of whether that proximity was relevant. She stopped crying, Carl said. He hadn't meant to say it. It came out anyway. Rick looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Herschel. Keep it locked in the storage room off the generator block, Rick said finally. Nobody handles it without telling me first. We don't know what it is. We don't know where it came from. We treat it like we treat anything we don't understand. He paused. With distance. Herschel nodded, but his eyes stayed on the skull. Thoughtful, troubled. Could the expression of a man whose understanding of the world had already been catastrophically revised once and was preparing, with weary resignation, for a second revision? That night Carl dreamed of the field again. The fog was thicker this time, and the rider was closer. Close enough that Carl could see the horse clearly. Black, massive, built like something from a world where horses were made for war rather than work. Its coat so dark it seemed to absorb the stormlight rather than reflect it. It stood with the absolute stillness of a trained animal awaiting a command, and on its back the rider sat equally still, equally patient, the silhouette ending at the shoulders in that same ragged, impossible line. Carl understood in the dream's logic that the rider was looking at him, that it had no eyes and no face and no head, and was still, undeniably, looking at him, the way you could feel someone's attention in a dark room before you could see them. He was not afraid. That surprised him, even inside the dream. He was 12 years old and he had been afraid of many things. Of the dark before the turn, of walkers after it, of his own capacity for the things survival required. But standing in that gray field with the headless rider, watching him from 20 yards away, Carl felt something closer to recognition than fear. Like meeting something that already knew his name. The horse took one step forward. Carl didn't move. Then Judith cried from somewhere behind him. Real, actual, pulling him up out of sleep. And the field dissolved, and he was back in the prison's gray morning with his heart steady and the cold of the carved stone still somehow present in his palms. When in the storage room off the generator block, behind a locked door, the garnet eyes held their quiet light. And outside, beyond the fences, the fog lay unusually thick across the yard. Nobody saw it happen. That was the detail that unsettled Daryl Dixon more than anything else. More than the bodies themselves. More than the way they'd fallen. More than the specific and methodical nature of what had been done to them. In 2 years of surviving the end of the world, Daryl had developed an instinct for the geometry of violence, an ability to read a scene the way a hunter reads disturbed ground. And what he read in the yard's mud that gray morning didn't fit any geometry he knew. 4 walkers, all dropped within a 15-foot section of the outer fence's east corner, here where the chain link had been compromised overnight by a section of fallen oak limb pressing against it from outside. The walkers had been working at the weakened section, 4 of them, then more beyond them in the tree line, drawn by the noise of the first 4's efforts. Standard breach scenario. They'd handled a dozen like it since taking the prison, except someone had handled this one first. The 4 walkers at the fence were not just dead. They were separated, each one cleanly at the neck, with a single cut of something heavy and extraordinarily sharp. Not a blade Daryl recognized. Not a katana. Michonne's work had a particular angle, a particular economy he knew well. Not an axe. The cuts were too clean, no splitting or fracturing of vertebrae. Unless something that moved fast enough and with enough force that the separation was essentially instantaneous. The bodies had dropped straight down rather than thrown, which meant whatever made the cut hadn't pushed through so much as passed through. A distinction that required a combination of edge and velocity that Daryl could not attribute to any weapon currently inside the prison's walls. He crouched in the mud and studied the single print. It was a hoof print, unshod, no iron shoe, no modern farrier's mark. Deep, which meant significant weight. The stride impression suggested the animal had been moving at speed, not walking, and it was singular. One print, pressed into the soft mud near the fence line, as though the animal had touched the earth exactly once in passing, and then, somehow, not again. Daryl stood and looked at the tree line for a long time. Then he went to find Rick. The group's reactions split along the lines that most things split along now, the practical and the everything else. Rick listened to Daryl's report with his arms crossed and his jaw set, absorbing details. Glenn asked the questions that needed asking. When, what angle, any sound. Maggie checked the fence line personally and came back confirming the cuts. Carol said nothing, but watched Carl's face while the report was delivered, the way Carol watched things, cataloging, patient, storing information for later use. Carl's face gave away more than he intended. He hadn't told anyone about the second dream. He hadn't told anyone that when he'd woken that morning with the field's fog still behind his eyes, he'd felt something that took him a moment to identify because it was so unfamiliar. Safety, a specific, settled sense that the perimeter was held, that something was watching the fence line that had nothing to do with the watch rotation Rick had established, something that operated in the hours between shifts in the particular darkness where the prison's generator lights didn't reach. "You know something," Carol said to him quietly, while Rick and Daryl were studying the fence line diagram Glenn had sketched. It wasn't a question. "I dreamed about it," Carl said, which was the most honest thing he could say without sounding like someone who needed to be relieved of his watch duties. Carol looked at him steadily. She had the quality that certain people who had survived tremendous suffering developed, an absolute absence of the instinct to dismiss. She had stopped dismissing things the moment the world ended, and possibly before. "What did you dream?" "A rider," Carl said. "No head, big black horse. He was at the fence line, watching." Carol was quiet for a moment. "Watching what?" "Us," Carl said. Then more specifically, "Judith." The fire in the main chamber crackled. Somewhere in the cell block's upper tier, Judith was sleeping through the morning in the steady unconscious confidence of an infant who had not yet learned that the world was dangerous. And Carl thought about her fingers touching the skull's cold stone and the way the garnet had flickered. And the way her crying had stopped so completely and so suddenly that it had felt less like comfort and more like acknowledgement, like something had heard her and responded. Herschel found him after dinner. The old man sat down beside Carl on the cell block steps with the careful deliberation of someone managing a leg that would never again be entirely reliable. And he held a paperback book that he'd found in the prison library. A regional history of Pennsylvania Dutch settlements, dry as chalk, the kind of book that survived apocalypses because no one had ever wanted to read it even before. He'd marked a page with a strip of torn oilcloth. "I've been reading," Herschel said, which was Herschel's version of, "I've been frightened and needed to do something useful with it." He opened to the marked page. So Carl leaned over and read the passage in the weak firelight. A paragraph about Hessian mercenary soldiers hired by the British during the Revolutionary War, and the specific regiment that had garrisoned a fort near what was now their county, and the legend that had grown up around one particular soldier, a cavalry officer, decapitated by artillery fire during a skirmish in the winter of 1778. Buried in the old churchyard east of town. Buried, according to the account, without his head, which was never recovered from the battlefield. And buried, according to the account's footnote, which someone had underlined in pencil, long before the turn, as though this detail had arrested them too, with a carved stone skull placed in his hands at the family's specific insistence. A tradition, the footnote said, from the old country. A way of giving the restless dead something to guard. Carl read the passage twice. "The churchyard east of town," he said, "is approximately 2 miles from where this prison was built," Herschel said quietly. Outside, the fog pressed against the prison windows like something breathing. Rick locked the skull in the storage room and told Carl to stay away from it. Carl lasted 18 hours. It wasn't defiance exactly, or it wasn't only defiance, the particular stubborn frequency Carl operated on that had driven Rick to exhaustion even before the world ended. It was something more like gravity. The skull pulled at him the way the dreams pulled at him, a low, persistent tug at the edge of a tension that didn't announce itself loudly but simply remained, constant and patient, until ignoring it required more energy than answering it. He'd felt something similar once before, standing outside a barn on Herschel's farm, listening to the sounds inside, knowing what was in there, and knowing Rick had said stay back and going anyway because some knowledge demands to be completed. He picked the storage room's lock with a piece of fence wire at 2 in the morning while the prison slept around him. The skull sat on the shelf where Rick had placed it, wrapped back in its oilcloth, and the moment Carl's hands closed around it, the cold came back. That purposeful, pressing cold that wasn't temperature so much as intention. He unwrapped it and held it in both hands and looked at it in the thin beam of his flashlight and felt the garnet inlays catch the light and throw it back in that deep ember way. And he thought about the churchyard 2 miles east and the cavalry officer buried without his head in the footnote's careful language. A way of giving the restless dead something to guard. Something to guard. He thought about Judith sleeping in the cell block. He thought about the 4 walkers dropped clean at the fence line, the single hoof print in the mud, the dreams of the rider standing absolutely still at the field's edge, with that ragged, impossible silhouette and the attention that needed no eyes to be felt. He thought about the way the group talked about the governor now, in the lowered voices and careful word choices that people used when they were afraid of a thing, but more afraid of what acknowledging the fear openly might do to the people around them. If Philip Blake was out there with his tanks and his militia and his particular brand of civilized cruelty, and the prison's walls were concrete and chain link, and the determination of people who had already lost too much to lose more, and those things were real and substantial, and they were not, Carl understood with a 12-year-old's unadorned clarity, enough. He sat cross-legged on the storage room floor with the skull in his lap, and he didn't speak. Didn't know what he would say, didn't know if speech was the relevant language here, but he held it the way you held something you were making a decision about, a complete and deliberate contact, and he thought about Judith, just Judith, her weight and her smell and the specific sound of her breathing when she slept, and the way she'd reach for the skull with her small fingers, in the absolute confidence of an infant who doesn't know yet that some things shouldn't be touched. The garnet inlays flared once, not flickered, not the subtle ember glow he'd seen before, but a full sudden flare like coals hit by wind, and then settled back to their deep, quiet light. The cold in his palms spread up his wrists and forearms, and then receded completely, leaving behind something that wasn't warmth exactly, but was the absence of cold in a way that felt deliberate, felt like a door closing gently rather than slamming. Carl sat in the dark and breathed. Outside the prison, in the tree line beyond the east fence, a black horse stood absolutely still among the pines with its breath misting in the autumn cold, and its rider sitting the saddle with the patience of something that measured time in centuries rather than hours. The rider's silhouette ended at the shoulders. No head, no face, no eyes to catch the prison's distant generator light. And yet the attention was there. That quality Carl had felt in the dreams, that orientation toward the cell block where an infant slept. Present and steady and absolute as compass north. The horse's ears moved once, tracking something in the tree line's deeper dark. 3 walkers shuffling along the fence's outer perimeter, drawn by nothing specific. The aimless migration that never fully stopped. The horse didn't move. The rider's posture didn't change. But something about the stillness shifted quality. From waiting to ready in a way that had no visible component, no tensing of muscle or gathering of weight, just a change in the character of the silence that surrounded them. The walkers reached the fence section and began their mindless pressure against the chain link. What happened next happened very fast and made almost no sound. By the time the prison's early watch, Glenn, on the 2 to 4 shift, walking the inner perimeter with a flashlight and the careful attention of a man who took his responsibilities seriously, swept his light across the east fence section. There was nothing to see. The fence was intact. The chain link showed no stress. And at its base, 3 shapes lay in the mud, with the particular stillness of things that had been stopped rather than fallen. Each separated cleanly at the neck with the same single precise cut Darrell had cataloged that morning. Glenn stood at the inner fence and stared at them for a long moment. He swept his flashlight slowly across the outer perimeter. Nothing moved in the beam's reach. Beyond it, the tree line was dark and still and gave nothing away. He keyed his radio. "Rick, you need to come see the east fence." In the storage room, Carl carefully rewrapped the skull in its oilcloth and replaced it on the shelf exactly as he'd found it, and relocked the door behind him and went back to the cell block and lay down beside his sleeping sister and stared at the concrete ceiling with the cold entirely gone from his hands and the field's fog receding from the edges of his mind like a tide going out. I'd leaving behind it the clean, flat certainty that the perimeter was held, that something was out there, that it had made its decision about them. Herschel told the story on the fourth night. It wasn't planned. It emerged the way things emerged around the prison's communal fire, organically, pulled forward by the particular gravity of a group of people who had run out of distractions and were left with only each other and the dark pressing against the windows and the questions that the dark kept generating. Rick had been quiet all evening. Darrell had come in from his perimeter check with mud on his boots and something careful in his expression that meant he'd found evidence at the fence line again and was deciding how to present it. Glenn and Maggie sat close together the way they always did now, one of the specific closeness of people who had learned that proximity was its own form of armor. Carol was mending something with the focused patience she brought to all tasks. Carl sat slightly apart from the group with Judith in his arms, and Herschel watched the boy and the infant and thought about the passage in the regional history book and what it implied and decided that knowledge shared was safer than knowledge hoarded, even when the knowledge was the kind that changed the quality of the dark. "There's a story," Herschel said, and the fire crackled as though agreeing. Everyone looked at him. Herschel had a particular authority that had nothing to do with the apocalypse. The authority of age and loss and genuine wisdom, the kind that accrued only through decades of paying attention to the world. When Herschel spoke at length, people listened the way they listened to weather. He told it carefully and without embellishment, because embellishment was for stories that needed help, and this one didn't. The Hessian officer, the winter skirmish of 1778, the artillery fire and the decapitation and the body recovered from the battlefield by his regiment and carried to the churchyard east of town with military ceremony and the particular grim tenderness that soldiers extended to their dead, the head never found. The carved skull placed in the hands at burial, brought from the officer's family, the old country tradition, the vessel for the restless, the object that gave the unquiet dead something to orient around, something to protect. In the brothers' Grimm tradition, Herschel said, Aylman, his voice had taken on the cadence of a man who had read widely and thought carefully about what he'd read. There is a recurring figure, the guardian spirit. Not benevolent in the way we use that word now, softened by centuries of children's versions, benevolent in the original sense, oriented toward protection, yes, but operating outside human moral categories entirely, following its own logic. The original Grimm stories were not comfortable. They were true in the way that things are true before civilization sands the edges off them. "You're saying the skull called him back," Rick said. His voice was flat and careful, the voice he used when he was taking something seriously against his preference. "I'm saying the skull is a binding object," Herschel said, "in the tradition. Something carved with specific purpose, outer-placed with specific intention, a focus for something that doesn't have the capacity to rest." He paused. "And I'm saying that whatever has been clearing our fence line for 4 nights has not harmed a single living person, has not approached the walls, has not, well, as far as we can determine, done anything except remove the dead from our perimeter with a consistency and efficiency that our own watch rotation cannot match. Because it's not sleeping," Darrell said. He said it without inflection, the way Darrell said most things, stripping the observation down to its functional core. "Because it's not sleeping," Herschel agreed. The fire popped. Judith made a small sound in Carl's arms. Not distress, more like commentary. And Carl adjusted his hold on her automatically, his eyes on Herschel. "In the stories," Carl said. "Wait, what does it want?" Herschel looked at him with the expression he reserved for questions that deserved better than a comfortable answer. "In the original stories," he said carefully, "the guardian spirit doesn't want in the way we want. It doesn't have desires or goals or a plan. It has an orientation, a fixed direction." He glanced at Judith. In every version of this particular legend I've encountered, and I spent most of yesterday in that library, the orientation is always toward the innocent, specifically toward children. He paused. The officer had a daughter. She was 4 years old when he left for the war. He never came back. In every account of the legend's appearances over 2 centuries in this county, the horseman has been seen proximate to children in danger. Specifically, another pause, never the danger itself. Always between the danger and the child. The silence that followed had weight to it, the specific weight of a group of people recalibrating their understanding of their situation. Rick stood and walked to the window and looked out at the yard. The generator lights reached the inner fence and stopped. Beyond that, darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, the tree line and the road that led to Woodbury and the governor's ongoing calculations about the prison's value versus the cost of taking it. Rick stood there for a long time with his hands at his sides and the particular stillness of a man thinking through implications. The skull, he said finally, without turning. Carl had it with Judith. Yes, Carl said, and you went back to it last night. It wasn't a question. Carl didn't insult his father by treating it like one. And yes, Rick turned from the window. His face in the firelight was unreadable in the way it was always unreadable now. Everything processed internally, everything weighed before anything showed. He looked at Carl for a long moment. Then he looked at Judith. The cost, he said to Herschel, in the stories. There's always a cost. Herschel's expression confirmed it before he spoke. In the original tradition, he said quietly, the binding runs both ways. The skull anchors the spirit to this side, but prolonged contact, sustained proximity to the living child who woke it, creates a current between them. The longer the skull is held, the stronger the dreams, the thinner the membrane. He chose his next words with the care of a man placing weight on uncertain ice. In the darkest versions of the story, and the child doesn't lose themselves quickly. They lose themselves gradually, in pieces. The guardian takes nothing deliberately, but its nature bleeds through the connection the way cold bleeds through a wall, not maliciously, simply because that is what cold does. Carl looked down at Judith. She was looking up at him with her dark, unfocused eyes, and she was perfectly calm and perfectly warm and showed absolutely no sign of anything wrong. And Carl thought about the dreams, the field, the fog, the rider, and how each time the rider had been closer, and how each time the cold had taken slightly longer to leave his hands after he woke, and how last night in the storage room the cold hadn't left his hands at all until he'd made the deliberate contact with the skull. Until he'd thought of Judith specifically and felt the garnet flare and the cold recede like something called off, like something that had heard him, that recognized the difference between Carl and the infant and had made a choice about which of them to focus on. Outside, a single hoofbeat landed in the mud of the outer perimeter, and then silence resumed, and Darrell at the window tracked his flashlight beam across the fence line and found it clear and clean and empty of the dead. The fire burned lower. No one spoke for a while. Winter was coming, and the governor was planning, and somewhere in the dark between the tree line and the churchyard, 2 miles east, the horseman rode his silent circuit, and the carved skull sat in the storage room with its garnet eyes holding their patient, purposeful light. One year in the story that had begun in 1778 in the cold of a Pennsylvania winter continued its long, unfinished arc toward whatever ending it had always been moving toward. The scouts didn't come back. Philip Blake, the governor, the title worn now like a second skin over whatever the man had been before Woodbury, before the arena, before the particular corruption that absolute power in a small enclosed community produced with such reliable efficiency, was not a man who accepted absence of information calmly. He had built his entire post-apocalyptic architecture on information, on knowing, on the specific advantage that came from understanding your enemy's position, strength, and vulnerability before they understood yours. The prison represented an obstacle he had been mapping methodically for weeks. Its fence lines, its generator schedule inferred from the light patterns, its watch rotation, the number of figures moving in the yard at different hours. He was patient in the way that dangerous men were patient, not because patience was his nature, But because he had learned that impatience was expensive, and he had already paid several costs he hadn't anticipated, he sent 4 scouts on a Tuesday, standard reconnaissance, approached the prison road from the northeast, cataloged the east fence condition, returned by midnight. They did not return by midnight. They did not return by dawn. Martinez brought him the news at breakfast with the careful delivery of a man who understood that bad news presented badly had its own consequences in Woodbury. Blake listened without expression, set down his fork, and asked the question that mattered. Were they taken, or were they stopped? Martinez didn't know. That was the problem. That was the specific texture of the information vacuum that had opened up around the prison's eastern approach. Not the ordinary fog of war, where you knew roughly what had happened and were missing details, but a complete absence. No sounds reported by the sentries on Woodbury's walls. No radio contact lost mid-transmission that would suggest ambush. No bodies found on the road at first light when Martinez had sent a 2-man team to check. Just 4 men who had walked northeast and ceased to exist. Blake spent the day thinking about it. He sent 2 more scouts that night, more experienced, with explicit instructions to observe only, not approach within half a mile of the fence line. They returned before midnight, which was the first encouraging data point, when and what they reported was the second, less encouraging one. They had seen something at the prison's east fence, at distance, in darkness, without being certain of what they were seeing. Something large, animal large, horse large, moving along the outer perimeter with a speed and silence that horses in their experience did not possess. Moving, stopping, moving again. And on its back, they were consistent on this detail, which was the detail that made Martinez's report to Blake stumble slightly in its delivery. A rider, a large rider, who appeared in the darkness and at distance to have no head. Blake looked at his 2 scouts for a long time. Then he looked at Martinez. Tricks, he said, which was what he said about everything that didn't fit his existing model of the world. Because Philip Blake's model of the world had no room in it for anything that couldn't be controlled, weaponized, or eliminated. And things in those 3 categories were tricks until proven otherwise. They've rigged something, a decoy, scarecrow on a horse, something mechanical, something designed to spook scouts and generate exactly this kind of report. He leaned back. It's smart. It's what I'd do. Martinez nodded, because nodding was the appropriate response to the governor's conclusions regardless of whether you believed them. Blake believed them approximately halfway. The half that didn't believe them, he put in a mental drawer and locked it, because that half had no productive application, and he was a practical man. He sent a coat. This was the detail that reached the prison 2 days later, not through any surveillance or intelligence of their own, but because a Woodbury defector named David, a middle-aged former accountant who had decided that Blake's particular vision of civilization was not one he could continue participating in, walked up the prison road with his hands visible and asked to speak to whoever was in charge. Rick met him at the outer gate with Daryl's crossbow providing editorial commentary from the guard post. David told them about the missing scouts. He told them about the 2 who'd returned with their report about the rider. He told them that Blake had received the report, declared it a trick, and this was the detail that David delivered with the flat affect of a man still processing what he'd witnessed, had received the coat the following morning. One of the missing scouts' jackets, left on Woodbury's gate overnight, folded neatly, no blood, no note, no indication of how it had gotten there or what had happened to the man who'd been wearing it. He's not sending it as a warning, David said. Whoever left that coat, it was too careful, too clean, like returning something borrowed. He paused. Philip's calling it psychological warfare. He's angrier than I've seen him since a long time. Rick listened to all of it without interrupting. Daryl listened from the guard post. Carl stood at the inner fence and listened too. Because Rick had stopped pretending that keeping Carl away from information was possible or productive, and because Carl's expression during David's account had the quality of someone receiving confirmation rather than revelation. The coat, Carl said when David finished. Which scout was it? David looked at him, mildly surprised to be addressed by a 12-year-old, then unsurprised in the way that people became unsurprised by Carl after approximately 30 seconds. The team leader, man named Crowley, he'd been with Philip since the beginning. Carl nodded slowly. He was thinking about the Horseman's pattern. The fence line cleared, the dead removed, the perimeter maintained. Never a living person harmed. The coat return to Woodbury's gate was consistent with that pattern in a way that was almost formal, almost courtly, in the way of something operating according to a code of conduct that predated the apocalypse by 2.5 centuries. The scouts had approached, the scouts had been stopped, but they had been stopped without dying, without blood, without the kind of violence that would have escalated Blake's response from reconnaissance to retaliation. Whatever had stopped them had made a choice about it, had chosen restraint. Carl thought about the field in the fog and the rider standing at its edge, and the quality of that stillness, not the stillness of something held back, but the stillness of something that understood the difference between necessary and excessive, that had been operating in the space between those two things for 240 years, and had developed, across that span, a precision about it. "No, he'll come anyway," Rick said quietly. He was looking at the road northeast toward Woodbury, the calculation running behind his eyes. The coat will make him angrier. He doesn't like things he can't explain. He'll come with everything he has, and he'll tell himself it's about the prison, and it'll really be about the thing at the fence line that he's put in a drawer and can't leave there. Rick turned from the road. "We need to be ready." Darrell descended from the guard post and stood beside Rick, and they looked at each other with the specific communication of two people who had survived long enough together that words were often unnecessary. Then Darrell looked at Carl, then at the storage block where the skull sat behind its locked door, with its garnet eyes and its patient light. "So do we tell it," Darrell said. "Sutter, or does it already know?" Carl looked at the tree line. Somewhere beyond the fence, in the space between the prison's light and the road's darkness, the black horse stood among the pines, and the rider sat the saddle with the absolute stillness of something that had already been told everything it needed to know. Not by words, not by the living, but by the cold and the dark and the particular clarity that 200 years of unfinished purpose provided. It already knew. The herd came on a Thursday. Not the governor's assault. That was still being assembled, still being calculated in Philip Blake's particular methodical way. The logistics of tanks and militias and psychological preparation, requiring more time than rage alone could compress. What came Thursday was organic. The way the worst things in the New World were organic. Not planned by anyone, not directed, simply the accumulation of small causes producing a catastrophic effect. A Woodbury patrol had discharged firearms 3 miles northeast while dealing with a small walker cluster, and the sound had done what sound always did in the dead world. Propagated outward in concentric rings of attraction, pulling walkers from every direction toward a point source that by the time they arrived had long since gone quiet and left them with nothing to orient on except each other's shuffling and the distant hum of the prison's generator. Darrell saw them first from the guard tower at 5 in the afternoon, a dark mass at the tree line's edge, still distant, but moving with the particular unified slowness of a large group that had found a direction. When he did a rough count and stopped counting at 200 because the number past 200 was academic, he keyed his radio. "Rick, east tree line. We've got a problem." The prison mobilized with the efficiency of people who had run this drill before and knew exactly how much it cost when the drill became real. Rick and Michonne to the outer fence with weapons, Glenn to the guard tower with the rifle, Maggie covering the inner gate, Carol getting Judith to the deepest interior cell block and staying there, Herschel coordinating from the common room with the radio. Carl assigned to inner perimeter support, close enough to be useful, far enough from the outer fence that Rick could focus on the threat rather than his son. Carl took his position and watched the herd come out of the tree line. 200 was conservative. The mass that emerged from the pines in the gray Thursday light was broader than the fence line's east section, deeper than any herd they'd handled at the prison, moving with the aggregate momentum of a thing that had no individual intelligence, but possessed a collective weight that made individual intelligence largely irrelevant. The fence groaned when the first wave reached it, a low metallic complaint that Carl felt in his back teeth. And then the second wave pressed into the first, and the groan deepened, and Rick was shouting positioning instructions, and Michonne's katana was working the fence line with the clean geometric efficiency that Carl had spent hours studying. And it was not enough. It was not going to be enough. Carl understood this before Rick did. Or before Rick allowed himself to say it. The specific arithmetic of the situation was simple and terrible. The fence had 3 compromised sections from previous pressure. The herd's front edge was already stressing 2 of them simultaneously. Michonne could clear the immediate press at one section. Rick could manage another. The third was 30 yards south of their position, and there was no one to cover it, and the walkers had found it already. The way water found the low point. The way the dead found weakness, with the unerring instinct of things that had no capacity for anything except finding weakness. The third section buckled at 6:47. Carl saw it go. The chain link folding inward under the accumulated pressure. The fence post pulling from its concrete footing with a sound like a gunshot. The gap opening to a width that 3 walkers pushed through simultaneously. And then the gap widening as more came. And Rick turning at the sound and calculating the distance, and the number between him and the breach, and the expression crossing his face that Carl had learned to read. The expression that meant Rick was doing the math, and the math was coming out wrong. Then the hoofbeats came. Carl heard them before he saw anything, felt them, more accurately, as a vibration in the concrete under his boots, a rhythm that was wrong for the dead world's usual sounds. Too deliberate, too cadenced, too alive in the specific sense of something moving with intention rather than instinct. Then the black horse cleared the outer fence in a single jump that shouldn't have been physically possible. The fence was 8 feet. The horse cleared it with room to spare, as though the fence were a suggestion rather than a barrier, and landed inside the yard with an impact that shook the ground and scattered the walkers nearest the breach point in a radius of pure animal terror. Because walkers feared almost nothing, they had no survival instinct left to generate fear, but they had vestigial responses, fragments of the nervous system's ancient programming, and somewhere in that programming, the massive black horse triggered something primal and electric that sent the nearest 20 walkers stumbling backward in a wave of reflexive retreat that bought 3 seconds of space around the breach. 3 seconds was enough for the rider. Carl had dreamed it, had seen it in the field's gray light with the fog moving between them. But dreaming it and watching it in the prison yard's concrete reality were entirely different experiences. And Carl stood at the inner fence with his hands on the chain link and watched with something beyond fear or wonder. Something closer to the feeling of a story arriving at the moment you'd always suspected it was building toward. The horseman worked the breach in absolute silence. No voice, no battle cry, no sound except the horse's movement and the heavy whispered passage of the blade. A cavalry saber, enormous, moving with the economy of something that had been doing exactly this for 2.5 centuries and had refined the motion down to its irreducible minimum. Each stroke cleared one walker. Each stroke was identical to the last. The horseman didn't vary, didn't adapt. It didn't demonstrate anything so human as improvisation. He worked the breach the way a force of nature worked, with the consistent, inexhaustible application of exactly the necessary amount. Rick had stopped shouting. Michonne had stopped moving. The entire group stood in various positions around the yard and watched the horseman work the breach and press back through it into the outer perimeter and begin moving along the fence line's exterior, with the black horse keeping pace with the herd's edge, and the saber moving and the dead falling, and the systematic reduction of 200 walkers proceeding with a patience and a thoroughness that no living fighter could have maintained because no living fighter had that particular resource. The absolute inexhaustibility of something that did not tire because it did not live. It took 40 minutes. At the end of 40 minutes, the yard was quiet, and the fence line was intact, and the outer perimeter held a carpet of still shapes in the mud, and the horseman stood at the east fence's exterior, with his horse breathing mist into the cold air and his silhouette ending at the shoulders in the last of the evening light. And he was facing the yard, facing the group that stood in stunned silence staring at him. And the attention was there. That orientation Carl knew from the dreams, that fixed directionality that needed no eyes. It was facing Carl. It was facing the cell block where Judith was. Rick stood in the yard with his python at his side and looked at the horseman for a long time. Then he looked at Carl. Then he looked back at the horseman with the expression of a man revising his entire operational model of the world in real time and doing it with the grim, pragmatic efficiency that was Rick Grimes' defining characteristic. Not accepting this easily, not accepting it comfortably, but accepting it because the evidence was in the mud around the fence line, and denial was a luxury the apocalypse didn't offer. "Herschel," Rick said quietly into his radio. "I saw," Herschel said from the common room window. "The cost," Rick said. "The thing you said about the cost. We need to talk about it tonight." The horseman turned his horse and moved back toward the tree line with the same absolute silence he'd arrived with. And the darkness took him the way the darkness always took him, completely without trace, as though the air simply closed behind him. In the storage room, the garnet eyes burned steady and bright. Herschel laid it out by firelight with the regional history book open on his knee and 3 additional volumes he'd pulled from the prison library stacked beside him. A colonial Pennsylvania almanac, a slim academic text on Germanic folk traditions, and a water-damaged collection of local ghost accounts that had been shelved between a legal thriller and a cookbook and had consequently survived the apocalypse unread. He spoke carefully, and Carl listened, and Rick listened, and Daryl sat against the wall with his crossbow across his knees and listened in the particular way Daryl listened. Not moving, not interrupting, absorbing everything and filing it against future application. The binding ran both ways. Yeah, Herschel had said this before, but now he unpacked it fully, because the herd's defeat and the horseman's appearance in full daylight, or near daylight, the gray Thursday afternoon, counting as the closest thing to full exposure the horseman had yet made, had moved the situation past the point where careful partial disclosure was responsible. The skull was the anchor. Without it, the horseman had no stable connection to the living world. He existed in the space between, the cold margin where the dead lingered before whatever came next, and the skull gave him a fixed point to orient from, a reason to stay rather than drift. This was the gift of the original carving, the old country tradition, the family's specific insistence at the burial, not summoning so much as inviting, and leaving a door open that the officer's unfinished paternal devotion had walked through and never walked back out of. The child's contact had deepened the connection. Judith's fingers on the stone, the garnet's flare, the immediate cessation of her crying, these were not incidental. In the tradition Herschel had been reading, the guardian spirit's binding was always initiated by the innocent, never by the adult seeking protection. Children didn't call the horseman deliberately. They called him the way they called anything, by needing, completely and without calculation, in the way only the very young could need. The infant's distress had been the key. The skull had been the lock. The officer's 200-year vigil had provided the will. Carl's contact reinforced it, Herschel said, and looked at Carl directly when he said it. And each time you handled the skull, each time you thought of Judith while holding it, you were feeding the connection, making it stronger, making him more present. More present meaning what exactly, Rick said, meaning the membrane between his state and ours gets thinner. He's more capable, more able to act, more able to sustain action, more visible, more powerful in the physical world. Herschel paused. But the thinning runs in both directions. He becomes more present here, and whoever holds the skull becomes more present there. The fire crackled. Carl looked at his hands. "How far has it gone?" Rick said. Not a question exactly, an inventory request. "The dreams," Carl said. "Every night. He's closer each time. The cold in my hands. It takes longer to go away. Last night it didn't go away completely until morning." He paused. "And I don't feel different. I feel," he searched for the word, colder, like there's a draft somewhere that only I can feel." Rick looked at Herschel. "It's reversible at this stage," Herschel said carefully. "In the tradition, if the skull is sealed, wrapped in iron, buried, returned to consecrated ground, the connection breaks. The horseman returns to his in-between state. Carl returns to full, returns to himself completely. But, Rick said, because there was clearly a but. But the protection end, Herschel said, completely and immediately. He doesn't linger. He doesn't make exceptions. The binding is the connection, and the connection is the skull, and if the skull is sealed, he goes back and stays back. He closed the regional history book, and the governor is coming. We all know he's coming. After Thursday's herd, after what his scouts reported seeing, he's coming with everything he has, and he's coming soon, because Philip Blake does not sit with things he can't explain, and the Horseman has become something he can't explain. The silence that followed had a particular quality. The silence of people sitting with an impossible choice and feeling its weight settle onto them with the slow inevitability of winter. Carl spoke first. "Then we don't seal it yet," he said. Rick looked at him. "Not until after the governor," Carl said. "We seal it after, when it's over." He said it with the flat, reasonable delivery he'd learned from watching Rick make hard calls, stripping the emotion out of the presentation so the logic could be evaluated on its own terms. "The cost to me right now is dreams and cold hands. I'm not losing myself. I'm still here. And what he does to the fence line every night, what he did Thursday, we can't replace that. We don't have enough people to replace that. If the governor hits us while the connection's broken, we lose." He paused. "So we don't break it yet." Rick looked at him for a long time, the complete measuring look that Carl had grown up under and had learned to hold without flinching. "You're 12 years old, Palmer," Rick said. "I know," Carl said. "This is not your decision to make." "I know that too," Carl said, "but it's my cold hands, and it's Judith." He met his father's eyes. "You'd make the same call." The fire popped and threw light across Rick's face, and Carl watched his father do the thing he always did. The internal processing, the weighing, the calculation that accounted for every variable, including the ones that hurt to account for. Carl watched him reach the place where the math came out the same way Carl's had come out, and watched him hate that it came out that way, and watched him accept it anyway because Rick Grimes had learned the same lesson that Westeros taught its inhabitants. That survival demanded the surrender of comfort, and the surrender of comfort included the comfort of protecting your children from the choices that needed making. "After the governor," Rick said finally. "We seal it after." Carl nodded. Darryl uncrossed his legs and stood up from the wall and slung his crossbow and walked to the window and looked out at the dark yard without saying anything, in which was how Darryl registered that something had been decided he didn't fully like and was accepting anyway because the alternative was worse. Herschel closed his books. That night Carl dreamed of the field, and the rider was at the fence line, not 20 yards away, not 10, but at arm's reach, the black horse's breath warm on Carl's face in the dream's strange logic. Warm despite everything. Warm despite the cold that surrounded the rider like a climate. Carl reached out and put his hand flat against the horse's neck, and the animal was solid and real under his palm, and the rider sat above him with the ragged silhouette and the attention that needed no eyes, and Carl looked up at it and said the only thing that felt true. "Not yet," he said. "We need you a little longer." The rider was still. The horse breathed. When the field's fog moved in slow, deliberate waves, and somewhere beyond it, in the real world, the prison sat in its autumn dark, and the governor sharpened his plans against the whetstone of his anger, and the skull burned garnet bright in the storage room, and the cold moved through Carl's bones like a tide that was learning, slowly and with great patience, the geography of him. The governor came on a Sunday. He came the way he always did things, completely without half measures, with the particular totality of a man who had decided that anything worth doing was worth doing in a way that left no argument about whether it had been done. 2 trucks, a tank. The tank, the one piece of hardware that changed every tactical equation because there was no counter to it inside the prison's available arsenal. No RPG, no AT weapon, nothing that could stop 40 tons of steel moving at 20 miles an hour except 40 tons of something else. 40 armed Woodbury fighters in the trucks and on foot, spread across the road approach in a formation that covered the gate and both flanks simultaneously. Blake himself standing in the truck bed with a megaphone, and the expression Carl had heard described by the survivors who'd come from Woodbury, the public face, the reasonable voice, the performance of civilization wrapped around the absolute willingness to do whatever the moment required. It was 6 in the morning. The light was flat and gray and cold. Rick had known it was coming, not the specific day, but the shape of it, with the inevitability of it. And the prison had spent the preceding 3 days in the kind of preparation that was less about optimism and more about refusing to be surprised. Positions established. Ammunition distributed. Glenn and Maggie on the upper tier with the rifles. Michonne at the inner gate with her katana, and the focused stillness of someone who had already made peace with what was about to happen. Daryl on the guard tower, with sight lines covering the road approach. Herschel with Judith in the deepest interior block. Carol beside him, Beth beside her. Rick at the outer gate with his python and the negotiating posture he'd learned to adopt. Weight balanced, hands visible, voice even. That bought time even when time was the only thing left to buy. Carl was at the inner fence. He had the skull. He'd taken it from the storage room at 4 in the morning while the prison was at its quietest, and Rick was doing his pre-dawn rounds. Taken it not with the wire pick this time, but with the key Rick kept on his belt, which Carl had lifted and replaced without his father noticing, which said something about either Carl's improving skill or Rick's exhaustion or both. He'd wrapped it in his jacket and carried it to his position at the inner fence, and held it there in the gray pre-dawn cold, and felt the connection hum through his palms like a live wire, and thought about what he needed, and thought about Judith's face, and thought about the field and the rider, and the 240 years of unfinished devotion that the carved stone had been holding in trust for this, for some version of this, for the moment when the thing it had been built to protect against arrived in full. Blake's megaphone voice carried across the yard at 6:15. Rick Grimes, I'm going to give you one opportunity to open that gate. One. After that, the conversation changes character. Rick's response was measured and calm and bought approximately 4 minutes before Blake made a hand signal, and the tank's engine note changed and the outer fence's main gate ceased to exist. What followed was the organized chaos that all battles became once the first variable exceeded the plan's tolerance. The trucks pushing through the gap, the fighters spreading into the yard in the formation they'd rehearsed. Glenn and Maggie opening fire from the upper tier and dropping 2 of Blake's fighters in the first 10 seconds and forcing the rest into cover. Michonne moving through the yard with her katana in the terrible, efficient way she moved. Rick firing from behind the inner gate's concrete pillar. Daryl's bolts finding targets from the guard tower with the patient accuracy of a man who did not miss. And Blake's 40 becoming 35 and then 30 and then the tank's cannon traversing toward the cell block's main wall and Rick shouting for everyone to fall back and the inner perimeter becoming untenable and Carl standing at the fence with the skull in both hands and his jaw set and the cold moving through him from his hands to his elbows to his shoulders like water finding its level and thinking, not praying. Carl didn't pray. But that had gone with a lot of other things. But thinking with complete and focused clarity about his sister in the deepest block, and Herschel's leg, and Carol's hands that were always doing something useful, and Glenn who laughed at things that weren't funny because laughing helped, and Maggie who loved Glenn, like the world hadn't ended, and Daryl who showed care through action, because words cost him something, and Rick standing behind a concrete pillar with his python, and 30 years of loss distributed across his face, fighting for a prison because the prison was home, and home was the only thing left worth the word. Carl thought about all of it and held the skull and the garnet flared white. Not the ember glow, not the deep quiet light of the thing at rest. White, sharp and sudden and total, a flash that Carl felt rather than saw. Something that moved through his hands and up his arms and through his chest like a plunge into cold water, and out the other side into something that wasn't cold at all, something that was simply vast and old and present in the way that things present for centuries were present, with the absolute density of deep time compressed into a single moment. The hoofbeats came from everywhere at once. The black horse cleared the inner fence the way it had cleared the outer fence. As though the fence were a suggestion, as though barriers were a category that applied to other things. and landed in the yard between the advancing Woodbury fighters and the prison's retreating defenders, and the sound of it. The impact of four hooves and however many hundreds of pounds of horse and rider hitting concrete simultaneously stopped everything for one full second, the way a thunderclap stopped everything. Both sides, all movement, all sound, except the horse's breath and the creak of the rider's saddle. Blake's fighters saw it first from the front. 30 men who had survived 2 years of the apocalypse, who had killed walkers and people and whatever else the New World had required, who had been selected by Blake for their toughness and their willingness. 30 men looked at the horseman in the prison yard's gray morning light and took a step backward. Not all of them. 6 or 7 held, but 23 took a step backward, which was the most honest review of the horseman's presence that any critic could have offered. The rider moved. Carl had watched it at the fence line, had dreamed it in the field. But this was the horseman without restraint, without the measured economy of perimeter clearance, without the patient, systematic reduction of a walker herd. This was the horseman responding to a threat against the children he was bound to, and the difference between the two was the difference between a controlled burn and a wildfire. The saber moved faster than Carl's eyes could track cleanly. The horse moved through the yard with a momentum that Blake's fighters couldn't organize against because it came from every angle sequentially. The rider was here, and then there, and then somewhere else. The horse never stopping, never presenting a static target. The saber's arc leaving a geometry of consequences across the yard that Blake's fighters couldn't close around because closing required predicting the next position, and the next position was always wrong. 6 of Blake's fighters broke and ran through the gate gap. 8 more fell back to the trucks. Blake stood in the truck bed and watched his formation dissolve, and his face went through several things: disbelief, calculation, the specific fury of a man whose model of the world had just been publicly and violently revised. And then he raised his rifle and fired at the horseman twice, which accomplished nothing, and Carl watched the bullets pass through the rider's silhouette without apparent effect, and understood with the dream's absolute certainty that you couldn't shoot something that was only partially present in the living world. You could only send it back, or keep it here. Michonne put her katana through Philip Blake's left shoulder from behind. She had moved through the chaos with the specific invisibility that chaos provided to those who understood its geometry. And Blake dropped the rifle and dropped to one knee in the truck bed, and the fight went out of his remaining fighters the way fight always went out of armies when their commander stopped standing. It was over in 11 minutes from the tank's first movement. Blake's people retreated through the gate gap with their wounded and their broken formation, and the specific silence of people who had seen something they were going to spend a long time not talking about. The tank sat in the yard with its engine running and nobody in it, the crew having exited through the hatch during the horseman's pass and joined the retreat without formal announcement. The horseman stood in the yard's center in the settling quiet. Carl walked toward it. Rick said his name, sharp, warning, and Carl kept walking across the inner yard, through the gate gap, into the outer yard where the horseman sat his horse in the gray morning light, and the garnet skull burned steady in Carl's hands, and the cold was everywhere in him now, deep in his chest. But it didn't feel like loss. It felt like the cold of a clear winter morning, the clean cold, the cold that meant the air was honest. He stood 10 feet from the horse and looked up at the rider. The attention came down on him like weather, full and total and without the distance of the dreams. Up close, the horse was immense, its coat so black it seemed dimensional rather than colored, its eye when Carl met it dark and calm and ancient. Where the rider above was still, the ragged silhouette, the absence where a head should be, the enormous cavalry saber resting across the saddle with the patient authority of a thing that had done its work and was waiting for acknowledgement or dismissal. Carl held the skull up. "Thank you," he said. He didn't know if it understood language. He didn't know if gratitude was a category that applied to something operating outside the living world's emotional register. But he said it because it was true, and because Herschel had taught him that true things deserved to be said, regardless of whether the recipient could fully process them. And because the officer buried in the churchyard 2 miles east had spent 240 years waiting for someone to acknowledge what he was still doing and why. The horse lowered its head once, slowly, Utwa completely, the gesture unmistakable. Then the horseman turned and walked toward the tree line, and the morning took him, and the yard was quiet, and Rick's hand came down on Carl's shoulder from behind and stayed there, heavy and warm and real. In Carl's hands, the garnet burned its last bright pulse and settled back to its deep ember glow. The cold in his chest began, slowly, to recede. They sealed the skull on a Monday. Herschel had prepared for it with the same methodical care he brought to medical procedures. Not because the sealing required complex materials, but because he understood that ritual mattered, that the manner of doing a thing shaped what the thing meant, and that what this thing meant deserved to be shaped carefully. He had found iron, actual iron, not steel, the older metal, and the one the folk traditions specified, in the prison's maintenance block, a length of iron banding used for securing equipment pallets, and he had cut it into strips with a hacksaw and bent the strips by hand into a cage that fit around the skull's carved contours with the imperfect, loving precision of something made without proper tools by someone who understood why it needed to be made. He worked at the common room table while the group watched or pretended not to watch, and Carl sat across from him with the skull on the table between them and the garnet inlays burning their steady deep light. And Rick stood at the window with his back to the room in the specific posture that meant he was present and listening and needed the window to do it. The prison was quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet in weeks. Webb Lake's retreat had not been a rout. The man was wounded, not broken, and Michonne's katana through his shoulder had been intended to stop rather than finish, because Rick had made a call about what kind of people they were going to be, and finishing a wounded man trying to retreat was on the wrong side of that line, regardless of what Blake had done and would do. He was out there. He would recalculate. He would come back eventually with a different approach, because that was what Philip Blake did. He iterated on failure until failure became something else, but eventually was not today, and today was what they had. And today the yard was clear, and the fences were intact, and the tank sat in the outer yard as a salvage prize that Glenn was already examining with the focused, acquisitive attention of a man who understood that 40 tons of steel had applications beyond its original purpose. David, the Woodbury defector, had watched the battle from the inner cell block with Carol and Herschel and Judith, and had come out afterward with the expression of someone whose decision to defect had been comprehensively validated, and Rick had looked at him for a long moment and then told him he could stay, which was Rick's way of saying welcome, and I'm watching you simultaneously. The prison felt, for the first time in months, like it might become the thing Rick had always wanted it to be. Not safe. Safety was a word that had lost its absolute meaning in the New World, but defensible, sustainable. A place where the specific brutal arithmetic of survival might, with sufficient care and sufficient luck, produce something that resembled a future. Carl looked at the skull on the table and thought about what it had cost and what it had given, and tried to hold both things at once without letting either one crowd out the other. The cold had been receding since the moment in the yard when he'd held the skull up and the horse had bowed its head. Slowly, incrementally, like a fever breaking, like winter releasing its grip on ground that was ready for spring. He'd slept the previous night without dreaming of the field, which was the first dreamless night he'd had since finding the skull in the cell block wall. And he'd woken with his hands warm and the particular sensation of full presence in his own body that he hadn't fully noticed losing until it began coming back. He was here. All of him was here. The membrane had thickened back to its proper opacity without his having to do anything except stop feeding the connection, stop handling the skull, stop thinking of Judith while the stones cold pressed against his palms. Judith was here too, 3 feet away in her makeshift seat, regarding the proceedings with the serene observational confidence of an infant who found the world comprehensively interesting and had not yet developed the capacity for existential unease. Carl watched her watch. Herschel bent the iron strips around the skull's carved contours and felt the thing he always felt when he looked at her. The specific gravity of it, the weight that wasn't burdened so much as anchor, the thing that kept him oriented in a world that worked very hard to disorient everyone in it. She had called the Horseman, not deliberately, not with any understanding of what she was doing. She had reached for something cold and strange with the absolute confidence of the very young, and 240 years of a father's unfinished love had responded to a child's need with the only language it had left: action, presence, the patient, inexhaustible work of keeping the darkness back. Carl thought about the officer in the churchyard 2 miles east, buried without his head, his hands wrapped around a carved stone vessel his family had brought from the old country so that the restless dead might have something to guard. A daughter 4 years old when he left. Never came back. My 2 centuries of riding the perimeter between the living and whatever came for them, in the cold margin between states, sustained by the specific devotion that didn't know how to stop even when the body that had housed it was long since dust. He understood it. That was the thing that surprised him. How completely he understood it. He was 12 years old and he understood exactly why something would choose to keep going after every rational reason for continuing had been removed. Because he had Judith. And having Judith meant having a reason that existed outside the category of rational, outside the category of cost-benefit, outside every calculation except the one that said she was here, and therefore he was here, and therefore the perimeter would be held. "Ready," Herschel said quietly. Carl looked at the skull one last time, and the garnet inlays held their deep ember light, patient, steady, the light of something that had been burning a very long time and had learned not to spend itself on urgency. Carl thought about the field and the fog and the rider at its edge, and he hoped with the particular sincerity of someone who had stopped hoping for many things that wherever the officer went when the connection broke, it was somewhere that had fields in it, green ones, warm ones, the kind a cavalry officer from the old country might have dreamed about in the winter of 1778 before the artillery found him, the kind a 4-year-old daughter might have run across toward her father in the story's version where he came home. He nodded to Herschel. Herschel placed the iron cage around the skull and pressed the final strip closed and the garnet light dimmed. Not suddenly, not like a candle snuffed, but gradually the way stars faded at dawn, relinquishing the dark to something larger and warmer. Down through ember to coal to the faint memory of heat and then nothing. The stone went cold in the way that stone was supposed to be cold, ordinarily without intention, without the purposeful pressing quality that Carl had felt in his palms for 2 weeks. The connection broke cleanly. Carl felt it go, a sensation like a door closing at the far end of a long corridor, quiet and final and somehow courteous. The way you closed a door when someone in the house was sleeping and you didn't want to wake them. The cold left his chest completely. Outside, the morning was gray and cold and ordinary, and the tree line stood at the prison's edge with its pines dark and still and empty of anything that moved with intention. In when the road northeast toward Woodbury held nothing except the distance, and the yard was quiet, and the fence line was intact, and in the mud of the outer perimeter, the last hoofprint, single, deep, pressed into the soft earth near the east fence, where the oak limb had first weakened the chain link, remained, already beginning to fill with the morning's light rain, already beginning its return to the ordinary ground from which it had briefly been distinguished. Rick turned from the window and looked at his son. Carl met his father's eyes and held them, and saw in Rick's face the thing that Rick rarely let show completely. Not pride exactly, something older and more complicated than pride. Something that had to do with the specific anguish of watching your child become capable of things you wish they didn't need to be capable of. And the love underneath the anguish that made the anguish bearable, that made all of it bearable. "It's done," Carl said. Rick crossed the room and put his hand on Carl's head. Not the shoulder this time, the head, the gesture from before everything, from the world that had ended, the gesture of a father and a son in the ordinary life that the turn had taken from them, and left it there for a moment without speaking. Judith made a sound that might have been commentary or might have been hunger, and Carl picked her up and she was warm and solid and entirely, perfectly present. And outside the rain came down on the prison yard and filled the hoofprint in the mud, and the oak limb lay against the fence where it had always been, and the morning continued in the way that mornings continued. Indifferently, relentlessly, with the complete disregard for human significance that was either the world's cruelty or its mercy depending on what you needed it to be. In the churchyard 2 miles east, beneath the old stone marker with the name worn past reading by 2.5 centuries of weather, something that had been present for a very long time was no longer present, and something that had been waiting for a very long time, the particular piece of the finished, the rest of the task completed, the perimeter finally held by people capable of holding it, had at last arrived. The iron-wrapped skull sat on the common room table. The garnet eyes were dark. The rain fell. They would find the hoof print again in spring, preserved somehow beneath the mud's surface, pressed so deep by that final landing that the earth had taken it permanently into itself. A fossil of something that had passed through rather than lived in the world. Beth would find it first and call the others, and they would stand around it in the March light and say very little, which was the appropriate response to certain kinds of evidence. Herschel would write 4 pages in his journal that night. Careful, precise, the account of a man of faith who had encountered something that complicated his faith, not by contradicting it, but by expanding it into territory his theology had not previously mapped. He would seal the journal pages with the same iron banding and add them to the box where the skull was stored, because some accounts belonged with their subject. Carl would not dream of the field again. But sometimes in the hour before dawn, when the prison was at its quietest, and Judith slept beside him with her complete unconscious trust, he would lie awake and feel the absence of the cold in his hands, and think about a cavalry officer who had loved his daughter enough to keep riding for 240 years. And he would understand with the clarity that only the very young and the very old possess simultaneously, the clarity of those who had not yet learned to look away from true things. That love did not require a body to be real, that devotion did not require a voice to be heard, and that some guardians rode their circuits long after the world had stopped believing in them, sustained by the oldest and most stubborn fuel there was. The governor was still out there. The winter was coming. But tonight the fence line was clear, and Judith was warm, and the hoof print was in the mud, and Carl Grimes pulled his sister closer and closed his eyes and slept without dreaming. And the prison breathed around them in the dark, and the iron-wrapped skull sat in its box and kept its silence. And somewhere in the cold margin between states, in the place where the restless went when their work was finally done, a cavalryman from the old country put down a saber he had carried for 2 centuries and 40 years and rested.